11 years ago, Lynn Margulis passed away on November the 22nd. This episode is to commemorate her fruitful life and fearless demeanor. Fiercely intelligent with a tongue-in-cheek and upbeat personality, Lynn Margulis was esteemed by many as a force of nature and by some as an obnoxious contrarian. An excellent theoretician, she had the foresight to predict how the eukaryotic cell came to be, in a time when the existing tools could not yet test the hypothesis. Her ideas filled in the gaps which evolution could not account for and revealed fundamental biological truths that revolutionized how we see the living world today. "I was a very bad fourth grader, never did what I was supposed to," she said in an interview in 2004. "In fourth grade, I learned how to tell apart the bullshit from real authentic experience." This was real Lynn Margulis in a nutshell. A rebel who didn't like to be told what to do. A rebel with the cause. Hello, curious cats, and welcome to the 6th episode of Choosing.Science, where we will explore the life and work of evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis. Born the eldest of 4 girls on 5th of March 1938 to Leonie and Maurice Alexander in Chicago, Illinois, Lynn fought fiercely for her beliefs most of her career. Her mom was a homemaker and her dad was a lawyer. The passion for the sciences seemed to be ingrained in her fiber, despite the fact that her parents, although supportive, were far removed from anything scientific. Like many people that are intellectually precocious, she got bored in school and never completed any tasks that were required of her. In a 2004 interview with Jay Tishfield, the chair of the genetics department at Rutgers University, Lynn told him in her typical fashion that when she got into University of Chicago at the age of 14, in the early entrant program, none of the classes were required, and that is exactly why she went to all of them. Honestly, I can relate. There is something, deeply rewarding in doing whatever you want. The university had a unique approach in teaching their young pupils, in that they had to read all the original texts, for example, Principles of Heredity of Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, and she loved that approach a lot. Lynn said that science was a way of finding directly about the world from evidence, and that it felt right to go back to the source itself, nature. She said that college opened up her mind by showing her the scientific method and giving her the proper environment to engage her avid curiosity. This was a crucial moment in her career, as previously she was bored to death by the school system, which, like today, mostly tell us what you need to know and how you need to learn, squashing any sense of wonder for life. Then she met the prominent astrophysicist Carl Sagan at 16 when he was 20 years old at the university. They were on again, off again, until she turned 19 and got married. Who says nerds cannot star in a soap opera? She said that Carl Sagan was the one that showed her that people could actually do science, not just read about it, and gave him a lot of credit for her following her scientific career. They will go on having 2 sons, Dorian and Jeremy, and divorcing in 1957. 10 years later, she married the X-ray crystallographer Thomas Margulis, after accepting a position as a lecturer at Boston College. They had 2 more children, Zachary and Jennifer, and divorced in 1981. In 1988, she accepted the position in the botany department at the University of Massachusetts. There, she continued to lecture and write scientific papers and books over the years. The time of her PhD was the moment which fueled, in a sense, her whole scientific career. She said in the interview that the most fun thing she experienced while doing science was the realization that the chloroplasts and the mitochondria possess their individual genome separate from the nuclear one, which led her to formulate the hypothesis that the cell is actually a microbial community. Despite this fascinating discovery, 40 years later, in the aforementioned interview, she voiced the concern that probably she will have the same issues as another prominent scientist, Ivan Emanuel Wallin, who was the first person to specifically postulate and also test the idea that the eukaryotic organelles originated from bacteria and whose ideas were accepted long after he died. He ascertained that the mitochondria and chloroplasts are of symbiotic origin. Same thing with the cilia. These are the organelles which help some prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells to move around. He asserted that one will never understand developmental biology without looking at it as a microbial community ecology, and that symbiosis is a major force in the creation of new species. Lynn expanded on this idea and was the primary modern proponent for the significance of symbiosis in evolution. And luckily for her, she saw a lot of her ideas being embraced by the community before her passing, although not with a lot of fight. Although, after reading so much on her, I'm pretty sure she would have haunted her critics beyond the grave anyway. So, before moving onto a more in-depth look on her work and her very bubbly and eccentric personality, I would like to ask you the trivia question, the tradition I started one episode before. So I'll give you a bit of food for thought and maybe you'll learn something new as well. So the questions for this episode are as follows. What bacteria is most closely related to the mitochondria? And what about the chloroplasts? Have fun with this one. I was really surprised to find out myself. Okay, back to the program. Her most well-known work is on symbiosis, as I said before, which comes from the Greek symbiosis, I know, very original, which basically means living together. Very straightforward. Maybe you already heard of symbiosis in your science class. Maybe you're also studying it. And maybe you also heard the famous example of the lichen, a symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungus. But not sure if you were taught this concept in the context of evolution. Probably not, because at this moment it's still widely debated. But the main idea is that evolution did not only arise slowly through a series of mutations, but its big leaps are attributed, at least in Lynn's ideas, to organisms coming together. Lynn made a very interesting and strong point of outlining that calling this interaction mutually beneficial, which probably we were taught in school, is actually a trap, because it grossly simplifies the actual relationship between the symbiotic organisms. This made me think and challenge the definitions I was taught in school, as I remember learning this misleading version. One organism had to actively ingest the other, and both had to follow the fundamental imperative to survive. The one that was taken up had to develop a new strategy to adapt to its new conditions. And I can only imagine how it went. Hey, if you don't digest me, I'll share the nutrients with you. And this apparently turned into cellular Stockholm syndrome, because the captive one eventually stayed forever and formed a new symbiote. Lynn also highlighted the fact that she had to go against the neo-Darwinists, which she had a lot of bones to pick, who believed evolution to be purely a product of genetic mutations. But she argued that this can simply not account for the complexity of new organisms. She gave the example of using X-rays to mutate the fly's genome, or how she said in her last interview for Discover magazine in 2011, 6 months before she died, and I quote, "If you want bigger eggs, you keep selecting the hens that are laying the biggest eggs, and you get bigger and bigger eggs. But you also get hens with defective feathers and wobbly legs. Natural selection eliminates and maybe maintains, but it doesn't create." End quote. In the end, you won't get a new species of fly, you'll get a sick one most of the times. On the other hand, acquiring a new species of bacteria could give the fly the ability to maybe metabolize new compounds, for example, and in a quick jump give rise to a new species. An illustrative real-life example of this are some of the sea slugs that, upon starvation, they will start to eat algae. Sometimes they will digest the algae, but other times the algae will manage to escape its demise and will become integrative part of the slug. The slugs will do photosynthesis through this algae, assimilate their genome, and even pass it down to their offspring. In just one generation, they completely changed the game. I really liked one of the replies she gave in the 2011 interview on why it was so hard for scientists, and specifically neo-Darwinists, to even consider these new ideas. She said, I quote, "In the first half of the 20th century, neo-Darwinism became the name for the people who reconciled the type of gradual evolutionary change described by Charles Darwin with Gregor Mendel's rules of heredity, which first gained widespread recognition around the 1900s, in which fixed traits are passed from one generation to the next. The problem was that the laws of genetics showed stasis, not change. If you have pure breeding red flowers and pure breeding white flowers, like carnations, you cross them and you get pink flowers. You back cross them to the red parent, and you could get 3/4 red, 1/4 white. Mendel showed that the grandparent flowers and the offspring flowers could be identical to each other. There was no change through time. There's no doubt that Mendel was correct, but Darwinism says that there has been change through time since all life comes from a common ancestor, something that appeared to be supported when in early the 20th century scientists discovered that X-rays and specific chemicals cause mutations. But did the neo-Darwinists ever go out of their offices? Did they or their modern followers, the population geneticists, ever go look at what's happening in nature the way Darwin did? Darwin was a fine naturalist. If you really want to study evolution, you've got to go outside sometimes, because you'll see symbiosis everywhere." End quote. Well, I've never heard a scientist telling other scientists to basically go outside and touch grass, and I chuckled a lot when I heard this, not gonna lie. However, importantly to point out is that her, together with the proponents of symbiogenesis, do not negate Mendel's or Darwin's law, but as Lynn said, both are incomplete. The traits that follow Mendel's law are trivial. Do you have a widow's peak or a straight hairline? Do we have hanging earlobes or attached earlobes? Are you female or male? Mendel found 7 traits that follow his laws exactly, but the neo-Darwinists say that the new species emerge when mutations occur and modify an organism. I was taught over and over again that the accumulation of random mutations led to evolutionary change, led to new species. I believed it until I looked for evidence, she said later. But what made her actually question the status quo? She said that, I quote, "What you'd like to see is a good case for gradual change from one species to another in the field, in the laboratory, or in the fossil record, and preferably in all three. Darwin's big mystery was why there was no record at all before a specific point dated to 542 million years ago by modern researchers. And then all of a sudden, in the fossil record, you get nearly all the major types of animals. The paleontologists Niels Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould studied lakes in East Africa and on Caribbean islands, looking for Darwin's gradual change from one species of trilobite or snail to another. What they found was lots of back and forth variation in the population, and then whoop, a whole new species. There's no gradualism in the fossil record. End quote. Well, maybe this is a tangent, but do you remember the evolutionary tree most of us have been taught? Well, Lynn said something quite thought-provoking, I would say, on this. I quote, "Long-term symbiosis leads to new intracellular structures, new organs and organ systems, and new species as one being incorporates another being, which already is good at something else. This major mode of evolutionary innovation has been ignored by the so-called evolutionary biologists. They think they own evolution, but they're basically anthropocentric zoologists. They're playing the game while missing 4 out of 5 of the cards. The 5 are bacteria, prototists, fungi, animals, and plants, and they're playing with just animals, a fifth of the deck. The evolutionary biologists believe the evolutionary pattern is a tree. It's not. The evolutionary pattern is a web. The branches fuse like when algae and slugs come together and stay together." End quote. Now, I'm no evolutionary biologist by any means, but it does make sense, and I have never come across this view so far. It was very surprising and quite interesting. And the question is, are we indeed so limited that it is hard to conceptualize the degree in which life is connected, or is there not enough compelling evidence? Well, Lynn thought the first when asked if we are a species that has the, tendency to sometimes overrate itself. She said, "We can't help it. Look, there are nearly 7 billion people on Earth today, and there are 10,000 chimps, and the numbers are getting fewer every day because we're destroying their habitat." Reg Morrison, who wrote the wonderful book called The Spirit in the Gene, says that although we are 99% genetically in common with chimps, that 1% makes a huge difference. Why? Because it makes us believe that we're the best on Earth. But there is lots of evidence that we are mammalian weeds. Like many mammals, we overgrow our habitats, and that leads to poverty, misery, and wars. End quote. This seems to become more true every day, or it's always been true. But what do you think about this? Remarkably, this idea she had is certainly not new. She acknowledges in the interview that the first who came up with the concept of symbiosis came from Russian scientists in the 19th century. They hypothesized that all plants came from symbiotic events when they acquired the abilities to photosynthesize. She particularly mentioned Boris Mikhailovich Kozopolyansky, who in 1924 wrote a book called Symbiogenesis, a new principle of evolution, in which he reconciled Darwin's natural selection as the eliminator and symbiogenesis as the innovator. Kozopolyansky looked at cilia, the wavy hairs that some microbes use to move, and said it is not beyond the realm of possibility that the cilia, that are the tails of the sperm cells, came from flagellated cytodes, by which he clearly meant swimming bacteria. Margulis herself said in 2004 interview that these ideas were repressed for a long time because at that moment they simply couldn't be tested. One such example she gave are the sense organs of vertebrates, which have modified cilia. I quote, "The rods and cone cells of the eye have cilia, and the balance organ in the inner ear is lined with sensory cilia. You tilt your head to one side, and little calcium carbonate stones in your inner ear hit the cilia. This has been known since shortly after electron microscopy came in 1963. Sensory cilia did not come from random mutations. They came by acquiring a whole genome of a symbiotic bacterium that could already sense light or motion. Specifically, I think it was the spirochete, a corkscrew-shaped bacterium that became the cilia. End quote. Fortunately for her, she came in contact with the Russian scientist's ideas through her teachers in Chicago, who gave her access to the English translations of the publications. This is when the first spark lit up in her head. When asked if it was difficult for her as a woman, she admitted that in her personal experience she did not face sexism in general. Although when she was asked why she thinks her ideas were rejected, she said, I quote, "Do you want to believe that your sperm tails come from some bacteria? Most men, most evolutionary biologists, don't. When they understand what I'm saying, they don't like it." End quote. I can't with this woman. I could barely make any sarcastic jokes in this episode because she did all the heavy lifting for me. Well played. But in general, she didn't experience much issues regarding her gender when it came to her profession. Same in her family. She only had sisters, so there were no double standards, and at university she faced no problems in taking classes that were male-dominated generally. However, she experienced intellectual opposition and felt as a persona non grata for questioning ideas that are considered to be fundamental to science. She expressed something that deeply resonated with me. She said, and I'm slightly paraphrasing, I quote, "They didn't like me reading the old stuff because you know how science is. At MIT library, everything that is 8 years older is transferred from the science to humanities. Science is considered now, and if it is not now or tomorrow or yesterday, is not science." And that was never my attitude. It was probably Chicago background. In order to understand the problem, you had to understand what people have done in the past, and you had to know things that were out of your field. So this is where I had most of my problems. Instructors wanted me to stick with what I'm supposed to do homework, etc., and do not deviate to other fields. End quote. Now, I don't know if MIT library still has this habit, but fundamentally things have not changed that much. When writing an article, we still have this habit, or we're always pushed to cite the latest research. Anything older than 10 years was seen as old as time and not that relevant anymore, and it always struck me of how wrong it felt. I mean, can you cite every piece of science since Adam and Eve? No, primarily because they listened to the snake without asking questions like good scientists would have done, but also because it's simply impossible. On the other hand, the future is not the only one holding the treasures. The past can also be a source of great inspiration, as Lynn so eloquently proved. She said that research published way before her on early fossil records showed that 200 million years ago, when the atmosphere and soil were already oxidized, there was strikingly no evidence of plants. But there was evidence of cyanobacteria, which is a type of bacteria that has the ability to photosynthesize. So, in order to back up her big idea and concept, she had to know what the previous data was telling her and steer away from limiting her thinking. In a world where too many times ego prevails over facts, I think that we need to steer away as much as possible from falling in this trap. At the end of the interview, the last she ever gave, she talks about the state of the funding of her lab, and I was very surprised and quite saddened when she said that at the moment of the interview, so it was around, I think, 30 years of prolific activity, she was cut down to virtually zero. Because her ideas were so out there, and also because of the great pharma and clinical shift that happened in science, her ideas were deemed too philosophical and not revenue generating to be worthy of consideration for funding. And it is indeed very sad to see how politics and profit disable scientific discovery, and how this trend seems to worsen in the present. Related to that, this is what she had to say on, again, evolutionary biologists, computer modeling and funding in the Discover magazine interview. I quote, "When evolutionary biologists use computer modeling to find out how many mutations you need to get from one species to another, it's not mathematics, it's numerology. They are limiting the field of study, so that's something that's manageable and ignoring what's most important. They tend to know nothing about atmospheric chemistry and the influence it has on the organisms, or the influence that the organisms have on the chemistry. They know nothing about biological systems like physiology, ecology, and biochemistry. Darwin was saying that changes accumulate through time, but population geneticists are describing mixtures that are temporary. Whatever is brought together by sex is broken up in the next generation by the same process. Evolutionary biology has been taken over by population geneticists. They are reductionists ad absurdum. Population geneticist Richard Leontin gave a talk here about 6 years ago, and he mathematized all of it. Changes in the population, random mutation, sexual selection, cost and benefit. At the end of his talk, he said, we've tried to test these ideas in the field and the lab, and there are really no measurements that match the quantities I've told you about. This just appalled me. So I said, Richard, you are a great lecturer to have the courage to say it's gotten you nowhere, but then why do you continue to do this work? And he looked around and said, it's the only thing I know how to do, and if I don't do it, I won't get any grant money. So he's an honest man, and that's an honest answer, end quote. So for people in basic biology, basic science, but I guess mainly biology, this is still applicable. So if you know any basic biologist, go and hike them very, very tight. They probably need it. I have a couple of people in mind. Or, alternatively, just throw money at them. That should also work. I think it's going to work. Yeah. However, there is not to say, in any shape or form, that she was flawless or that all her ideas were correct. And she did receive a lot of criticism, and also I think a lot of valid criticism. And I will be quoting someone that I think put it together very nicely and kind of to balance out the image that I'm portraying right now about her. I think it's important to have both, let's say, good and bad. So the person that criticized her in this case was Jerry Coyne. He is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at University of Chicago, and the author of Why Evolution is True. I quote, Lynn Margulis did indeed have a clever and correct idea that revolutionized our view of how life evolved, but later became a victim of the big idea syndrome, thinking that because she was right about organelles, she was right about everything else. that led her to make repeated and completely unfounded attacks on evolutionary biology in the last decade, embarrassing herself with her pronouncements. Her legacy is a good one, but not unmixed. Rereading her chapter, Gaia is a Tough Bitch, only reinforces my opinion about her misguided criticism of neo-Darwinian evolution and her unwarranted antipathy toward population genetics. Not only did she fail to comprehend how population genetics has advanced our understanding of nature, the effects of inbreeding and of genetic drift are two such advances, but her views on speciation, a field in which I've worked for 3 decades, are simply wrong. Margulis' idea that new species originate from symbiosis has no empirical support. When we try to understand the genetic underpinnings of new species, we find that, with the exception of polyploidy, which means, by the way, different number of sets of chromosomes, so more than usual in plants, it always maps to changes in the DNA. That is, the splitting of lineages, like evolution within a lineage itself, is almost always the result of gradual gene by gene change. We have no evidence that symbiosis has been responsible for even a single case of speciation. All of us should honor Margulis' real contributions to biology, her recognition and working out of earlier suggestions that some cellular organelles were acquired by symbiosis, and that the ancestors of these organelles were bacteria. This was a tremendous advance, achieved in the teeth of substantial doubt. Sadly, Margulis' success in the face of such criticism seemed to have made her stubborn and dogmatic about her other biological views. And even sadder, those theories were often wrong. She strongly denied, for example, that AIDS was caused by the HIV virus, or that the HIV virus even existed. AIDS, she maintained, was simply syphilis, with the spirochete rendered undetectable because it formed the symbiosis with human cells. How does one balance her positive contributions against such a deadly form of denialism? We should always honor those scientists who have advanced our understanding of nature in ways as profound as Margulis. But let us also remember that being right about one big matter does not render us immune to error in other matters, and that scientific fame does not give us a free pass for all of our ideas." End quote. And that might as well be true. Maybe future research will prove all her hypotheses true, maybe invalidate all of them or just a few. I guess only time will tell. But I put this quote mostly to emphasize the fact that, even great scientists can fall short in some, ideological traps, because in the end they're still human. But that doesn't mean they stop being inspirational. I think idols should not be a source of inspiration, as they're not rooted in reality and they give us a false sense of perfection. But I would say rather observe and learn from great people, from their successes, from their shortcomings, and just embrace the paradox of the human nature. Lynn Margulis is a great example of this. She wasn't perfect, but she was exceptional. With this in mind, I also want to lastly talk about this Gaia theory that Professor Coyne referred. Gaia is a tough bitch. Great title. I wish I could write an article with swear words. I don't know how well that will go. But this Gaia theory was the last one she was working on at the moment when she died. And she helped develop this together with another great scientist, James Lovelock, who passed away actually this year at exactly 103 years old. I don't know if it's quite tragic to die on your birthday, but it's actually also quite cool. Anyway, so they came up with the Gaia hypothesis, which states that basically living organisms interact with their inorganic surroundings on Earth to form a synergistic and self-regulating complex system that helps to maintain and perpetuate the conditions for life on the planet. Sounds a bit convoluted, but I guess, yeah, Gaia being the Greek goddess of Mother Earth kind of makes sense to call it like that. And also the theory kind of sounds a bit esoteric in a sense, and unsurprisingly it has been, and it's still very heavily criticized on the grounds of not being properly factually supported. Although lately I've seen some proof that emerged in favor of this theory. This is maybe history repeats itself in a sense, because maybe it's exactly as what those Russian scientists thought about, and it was impossible to prove at that stage because there were no tools available. And maybe here this is the same, the same case. So it kind of makes me think that maybe in the future, who knows, the human race will come to such deep understanding of the natural laws that we will be able to harness its power, maybe before it's not going to destroy all civilization because we are reckless. But again, who knows? Some fantasy and sci-fi books became eerie predictions sometimes, and it's interesting how some people actually draw their inspiration from imagination that seems to be imagination at first, but then again everything is conceptualized firstly in your brain and then you test it out. But anyway, speaking of books, Lynn dedicated the last 8 chapters of her last book called The Symbiotic Planet to this Gaia hypothesis. And I highly recommend you to read it if this sounds like something interesting for you. I think it's really thought-provoking, at least. Maybe if you're not interested, or that doesn't really matter. The point is that it's a very out there idea, and I think it's good food for thought. But however, she objected to the widespread personification of Gaia, of how this Mother Earth that kind of keeps everything together and has its soul in a sense, and stressed out that Gaia is not an organism as some theories think, or how some people think, but rather an emergent property of interaction among organisms. She defined Gaia as the series of interacting ecosystems that compose a single huge ecosystem at the Earth's surface. And that's it. So nothing mystical actually happening, although maybe it sounds like this in the beginning. The book's most memorable slogan, if you like, was actually a remark by a student of Lynn's who said, I quote, "Gaia is just symbiosis as seen from space." Which, yeah, I think it's a good way to put it. I do believe that Lynn Margulis was a visionary, way ahead of her time, who was proven right enough times to keep her vision in mind. As she put it very simply and straightforward, as she seemed to have been, I quote, "I don't consider my ideas controversial. I consider them right." End Maybe she is. We'll see that. And as always, I would like to finish with a few words as usually about Lynn Margulis as a person outside of her career. And I have selected a few words from a commemorative book written by her eldest son Dorian, entitled Lynn Margulis, The Life and Legacy of a Scientific Rebel. And honestly, after reading the book is pretty much a collection of memories that different people in her life had about her, from her sons to her colleagues and so on. And first of all, I think that's so nice, someone to put this together for you after your passing, to commemorate your life like this. But also, it would be amazing if all our children will actually have these nice words about us after we pass this existence. So, without further ado, he said so, I quote, "Despite the rancor she elicited as a result of her forthright and fearless manner, and the adamancy with which she insisted on her points of view, the more so when, though supported with crucial facts, they were underdogs in the temporarily prevailing but ultimately malleable scientific consensus, Lynn also stood out because she could change her mind. She could learn and continue to do so to the end of her days. It is true that at times she may have been attracted to unorthodox views because they needed an ally in a world of consensus, a world paradoxically where her own views on symbiotic interliving were deemed untenable by coteries of co-actors teaming up and cooperating against a perceived intruder, like an immune system detecting bacteria as one being a threat. But her threat was not to people, but to the evil done to the spirit by the entrenchment of unsupported views. Although she could be a bulldog, her heart was soft, and her spirit loving beneath the scientific realpolitik of her conversation, and the insisting tough-mindedness of her sometimes strident and blunt, withering and refreshingly unadorned opinions. That deep intellectual honesty didn't always need to be right in details, to be right in approach, which it was, and could not else but be for her. In a privileged place to observe her intellectual and personal trajectory, I became more enamored of her as she grew older, and I tagged along, always a lucky 21 years behind her rushed schedule. At the end of her life, I became more fond of her as a person, an individual wonderful in her own right, and separate from the matrix that spawned and cuddled and argued with me, gave me simple gifts of clothes and books and peasant food, who always had demands and expectations, and as might be surmised, had trouble simply relaxing. Time was too short, life was too important to squander in it on trivial pursuits. So, that was the episode for this time. Of course, it's always hard to kind of capture someone's personality and life in such a short time. I could talk for hours and hours, but I think I got the essence of her, and I hope that we all find our passions in this way and we pursue it for real, and in a sense give you this inspiration to maybe do the same. Would it be easy? No, but I think a lot of the times it's worth it. She also lived a full life and left so many memories behind and so many people to remember her as well and cherish her. So I hope we all will have this opportunity to do the same. So, thank you for listening. Again, if you want to listen to more episodes, you'll find them on all important platforms, and please recommend it to anybody that would like to listen to such things if you liked it. If you didn't, I'm also open to any feedback and emails if you want to give me any suggestions. If you want to complain about my jokes, I might accidentally lose those emails, but I will read them. But I might lose them. You can try anyway. So, thank you again, and see you next time.